The massive arena of Altair Prime trembled with the echoes of war cries reverberating across the galaxy. Death lingered on the sand, and the scent of blood filled the space between the towering stone columns. The sky shook with the deafening cheers of thousands of spectators witnessing the carnage. Krando planted his sword into the ground, muscles tensed beneath his gladiator armor. His gaze locked onto the woman standing at the other end of the arena. They had never sent anyone like her before. She was a shadow. Her skin was as pale as moonlight, her eyes as deep as an endless ocean. Delia. He had only heard whispers of her name. The Queen of Assassins, a ghost from the depths of space, known for her silent executions, a woman who had single-handedly brought empires to their knees. Many had died by her hand, yet there were no records of her ever fighting in a gladiatorial arena. Why was she here? Delia studied Krando, her lips an eerie shade of ice blue curving slightly. This one, he looks too strong, she thought. But the assassin inside her immediately warned her, don't be fooled by appearances. He's a warrior, born to kill, just like you. Fate had brought them to this cursed arena. And now, one of them had to die. Krando took a step forward, the weight of his sword doing little to slow him. The sand crunched beneath his boots, the sound echoing across the Colosseum. Despite his massive blade, his movements were terrifyingly swift and balanced. Delia moved too, but differently. She was light, fluid, as if gravity barely touched her. As the distance between them closed, Krando's voice rumbled like distant thunder. What are you doing here, assassin? Delia tilted her head, her eyes gleaming. They bought me, she said indifferently. For entertainment, to fight warriors like you. Krando's steel gray eyes narrowed. Are you here to kill? To kill or be killed, Delia corrected. Same as you. A brief silence fell between them. The spectators roared. The fight was supposed to begin. But they only stood there, locked in each other's gaze. A warrior, a ghostly assassin. And in that moment, something shifted. Krando raised his sword. Delia tightened her grip on her daggers. Yet, in both their minds, the same thought echoed. There has to be a way out of this. The walls of the arena shook with the impatient screams of the crowd. They had come for a duel, for bloodshed, yet the warriors had yet to strike a fatal blow. Krando swung his sword toward Delia, but the blade barely grazed her armor, a deliberateness. Delia countered instantly, her dagger sliced toward his shoulder but left only a shallow mark. Barely any blood. The audience grew restless. Boos and whistles filled the air. Some stood, shouting at the arena officials in frustration. Krando lifted his sword again, battling the conflict within himself. Why am I hesitating? He had killed countless times before. Being a gladiator demanded it. And yet, now when he was supposed to strike down this assassin, his body defied him. Delia was no different. Her movements remained perfect, her assassin instincts razor-sharp. But the daggers meant to pierce Krando's veins hesitated, missing by mere inches. This is foolishness, Delia thought. I am a warrior, an assassin. So, why do I keep looking into his eyes? Krando squinted slightly, recognizing the same conflict reflected in Delia's expression. They both knew it. Something had changed. But what? The roars of the spectators grew deafening. The arena's overseer rose from his high seat, his face twisted with fury. More blood was needed. Krando stepped closer, whispering just loud enough for Delia to hear. We need to find a way out before they have us both killed. Delia's eyes narrowed. And what do you propose? But before they could form a plan, the heavy gates of the arena began to grind open. And from the shadows, 5 new fighters emerged. The crowd erupted into a frenzy, for now, the bloodbath they craved would surely begin. Krando and Delia turned to face the newcomers. The first warrior was a towering brute wielding a colossal double-headed axe. The second swung a spiked flail, his armor stained with the remnants of his past victims. The third, gripping a long sword in both hands, stood like an imperial knight ready to execute judgment. The fourth twirled a spear with effortless precision, a swift and agile combatant. And the fifth, Krando frowned. At the very back, walking with an almost pitiful gait, was a frail, weaponless man. His narrow shoulders slumped as if he might collapse at any moment. Compared to the other warriors, he looked almost comical. "Why is he even here?" Krando muttered. Delia narrowed her ice blue eyes, studying him carefully. Her instincts whispered a different truth. "The weakest-looking one is often the most dangerous," she murmured. Krando gave a slight nod, but his focus was already on the axe-wielding giant. To him, that was the real threat, but they both knew they were being drawn into a game of death. Now, there was only one option left: to fight together. They turned to stand side by side. The crowd erupted in frenzied cheers as if they had sensed the shift in the battle. Betrayal, chaos, and action. The scent of blood hung thick in the air. Who would strike first? The axe-wielding brute lunged forward, his massive weapon descending toward Krando. At the last moment, Krando dodged to the side, and the axe slammed into the ground, sending a cloud of sand flying. He was about to counter when the flail-wielding warrior attacked, his spiked ball hurtling toward him. Delia moved in an instant. With deadly speed, she deflected the spear-wielding fighter's strike. He stepped back, then immediately prepared for another attack. And in that moment, the frail and armed man opened his eyes. The mage's lips barely moved. No one had noticed it yet, but a thin, nearly invisible current of energy had begun to spread through the arena. Krando and Delia fought as if they had been partners for years, their movements synchronizing into a deadly dance. Krando's raw power and crushing strikes merged seamlessly with Delia's agility and precision. They adjusted to each other's attacks effortlessly. When one defended, the other struck. And this surprised them both. Delia could feel exactly when Krando would attack, when he would shift his stance. And Krando, in turn, found himself moving in perfect rhythm with Delia's speed. He had never felt such a connection before. It went beyond simple battlefield trust. Yet, their eyes kept flickering toward the scrawny man in the arena's corner. Why hasn't he attacked yet? Krando wondered. Delia, however, was growing uneasy. Because he's preparing something. At that moment, the axe-wielding brute made a sudden move, catching Delia off guard. But instead of slicing her down, he swung the shaft of his axe into her chest. Delia gasped, the impact knocking the wind out of her as she was thrown backward. She hit the ground hard, dust rising around her. The crowd erupted in a deafening roar of excitement. Krando's eyes flashed. He didn't think he acted. The moment the brute raised his weapon for the final strike, Krando was already there, moving like a storm. Krando seized the brute's arm and twisted with all his strength. Bone snapped. The axe tumbled to the ground. The warrior howled in agony, but Krando was not finished. He drove his forearm into the brute's throat and sent him crashing to the ground. Without wasting a second, he crouched beside Delia. Their eyes met. Without hesitation, Krando extended his hand. Delia, slightly stunned but secretly impressed, took it. In one swift motion, Krando pulled her to her feet. Their hands remained clasped for a brief moment. Then, a chilling sensation filled the air. The mage had not moved, yet his eyes were now glowing. "What is he doing?" Delia whispered. Krando clenched his jaw. "We're about to find out." The sands of the arena began to shift. A low hum vibrated through the air as the grains of sand lifted, swirling as if carried by an invisible force. The aura around the mage grew stronger with every passing second. Krando and Delia both knew if he finished whatever spell he was casting, the outcome would not be in their favor. Only one option remained: reaching the mage before it was too late. But first, they had to cut through the three warriors still standing between them. Krando tightened his grip on his sword, muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. Delia's gaze flickered between the mage and their enemies, calculating every possible move. Bam! The flail-wielding warrior attacked, his spiked weapon hurtling toward Krando's skull. Krando dodged at the last second, the flail smashing into the ground, sending shards of stone flying. Taking advantage of the opening, Krando grabbed the warrior's arm, twisted it sharply, and forced the weapon from his grasp. A brutal elbow strike sent the man staggering. Meanwhile, the spear-wielding fighter lunged at Delia, his weapon thrust toward her chest, but with breathtaking agility, Delia flipped backward, narrowly evading the strike. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she surged forward, slashing her dagger across his wrist. He yelped, his spear slipping from his fingers. Krando seized the disoriented flail fighter's head and slammed his knee into his face. The warrior collapsed, unconscious. Another enemy down, but time was running out. The air around the mage was almost shimmering now, and the sand that had risen from the ground seemed suspended in midair. Delia gritted her teeth. He's almost done. We have to stop him. Krando gripped his sword tightly, only to left in our way. The spear-wielding and sword-wielding warriors exchanged glances, then attacked simultaneously. Krando's blade swung with deadly precision, breaking through the spearman's defenses entirely. The man stumbled backward, eyes wide with brief terror before collapsing onto the sand. At the same moment, Delia expertly evaded the sword fighter's strike. As his blade sliced through the air, she swiftly ducked, spun behind him, and drove her daggers into his back. With a final, pained grunt, the man crumpled to the ground. Now, only one remained, the mage. Krando took a deep breath as Delia stepped forward. She locked eyes with him and whispered. At the same time, Krando gave a slight nod. Without another word, both warriors charged at the mage. By now, the air around him was fully vibrating. The ground trembled, the sand floated unnaturally, and even the spectators were beginning to realize that something was wrong. Some shouted in excitement, others watched with wary eyes. Krando and Delia raised their weapons for the final strike, and then, suddenly, a massive, swirling portal tore open right in front of them. Before either of them could stop, they were sucked inside. The last thing they heard was the mage's voice, echoing like a curse. This fight isn't over. A second later, they were gone. Krando landed hard on his back, but instead of sand and dust, he felt soft grass beneath him. As he inhaled, the air was fresh, free from the stench of blood and sweat. He opened his eyes to see a clear blue sky overhead. A few steps away, Delia had landed on her knees. She quickly lifted her head and scanned her surroundings. Around them stretched a vast forest, filled with towering trees covered in lush, green foliage. The air was filled with the sounds of birds chirping, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves. Krando immediately turned back. Was the portal still there? No. The swirling vortex flickered once, then collapsed inward, disappearing without a trace. Delia followed his gaze and scowled. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. Krando clenched his jaw, tightening his fists. Who brought us here, and why? Neither of them had an answer, but one thing was certain. This was nowhere they had ever been before. Krando crossed his arms over his chest, tilting his head slightly as he took in their surroundings. The blood-stained sands of the arena were gone, replaced by a soft, green meadow. Sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams, birds sang, and a crisp wind danced through the air. The serenity of it all felt completely absurd for two warriors who had just been seconds away from death. Krando let out a slow breath, shaking his head with a wry smile. Well, at least we found a way out of the arena. Maybe jumping into random portals is the best way to escape future battles. Delia shot him a blank stare. We didn't jump into the portal. It opened and dragged us inside. Krando glanced at her, then rolled his eyes with a smirk. Yes, Delia, I noticed that. It was a joke. Delia blinked, then shrugged. It wasn't funny. Krando clutched his chest dramatically. Ouch, you wound me. Delia simply stared at him, unimpressed, then turned her attention back to their surroundings. Krando chuckled, shaking his head. This alien assassin had no sense of humor. But strangely, he found that amusing. All right, I'll hold off on the comedy, he said with a grin. For now, we need to figure out where we are. If we were brought here, then there's a reason for it. Delia nodded. Who brought us here, and why? That was the real question. Krando slung his sword onto his back and took a long look around. Where were they? And more importantly, what were they supposed to do now? Instinctively, the two warriors shifted their positions, standing back to back, scanning the unfamiliar landscape with cautious precision. Krando tilted his head slightly, staring at the sky. The sun was shining bright, but something was off. The sun looks too small, doesn't it? He murmured. Delia looked up. Yes, the light was the same, but the size and color seemed different. There was a faint bluish hue to it, and then they saw something even more striking. Far in the distance, looming in the sky, were massive planetary rings, a silhouette stretching across the heavens. Krando and Delia exchanged glances. We're not on any world we know, Delia said firmly. Krando exhaled, rubbing his temple. Great. As if escaping the arena wasn't hard enough, now we have to figure out what cursed planet we're on. Delia didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the dense forest ahead. The trees were strange. The leaves had a purplish tint, and some trunks were perfectly smooth, without cracks or imperfections, almost as if they were crafted from metal. We need to find a path, Krando said, securing his sword on his back. Delia nodded, and together, they stepped toward the forest. They searched the ground for signs. If they had arrived here, there had to be something else, tracks, settlements, something. Krando kept glancing at the sky as they walked. If this is a moon, the gravity should feel different. But my body doesn't feel off at all. How can you tell? Delia asked. Krando smirked. If gravity were different, your knives wouldn't fly the same way. But you fought exactly like you did in the arena. Delia arched an eyebrow. Not surprised you noticed. You enjoy watching me fight, don't you? Krando chuckled. Should I take that as a compliment? Delia didn't smile, but there was a faint curve to her lips. Then Krando suddenly stopped. There, Delia narrowed her eyes. Ahead, almost hidden within the trees, was a barely visible path. A narrow trail weaving through the forest. The soil was compacted, slightly disturbed, something or someone had passed through recently. Delia knelt down, inspecting it. Not human tracks, but fresh. Krando slowly drew his sword. Then we follow them, but stay alert. This place doesn't feel friendly. Delia gave a silent nod, and together, they stepped onto the path, moving forward into the unknown. As Krando and Delia moved cautiously along the narrow path, the unnatural silence surrounding them became more unsettling. The forest was filled with the sounds of chirping birds, yet there was no sign of any other creatures, no rustling in the underbrush, no distant howls. Everything felt too orderly. Then, as they passed through a break in the trees, a massive stone structure emerged before them. A temple, ancient, covered in vines, built with towering stone pillars that had stood the test of time, yet somehow still intact. Its entrance was open, and a faint breeze flowed outward from within. Krando narrowed his eyes. This place is old. But it doesn't look abandoned. Delia nodded. Someone could still be here. Keeping their weapons at the ready, they stepped inside. Inside the temple, dim beams of light filtered through massive stone windows. A faint scent of incense lingered in the air. The floor was covered in massive stone slabs, each etched with ancient symbols. And at the center of it all, sat a man. Old, his long, white beard draped down to his knees. He wore a simple robe of brown and gold, his eyes closed as if meditating. Yet, the moment Krando and Delia entered, he smiled. At last, you have come, he said. Krando hesitated. You were expecting us. The old man slowly opened his eyes, deep, knowing eyes. He studied Krando with quiet certainty. I was expecting you, Krando. Delia's hand immediately went to her dagger. How do you know his name? The monk smiled and slowly rose to his feet. Because this land belongs to him. This is his inheritance. Krando's brow furrowed. What are you talking about, my home? But he stopped mid-sentence, because his eyes had landed on something. A massive stone tablet carved into the back wall of the temple. Depicted upon it were figures resembling human warriors, locked in battle. And in the very center, was a man wielding a sword. A sword that was exactly like Krando's. Krando's breath caught. What does this mean? He whispered. The monk stepped closer. Krando, your ancestors came from here. This is humanity's home. This is Earth. Delia's eyes widened. What Earth? Krando couldn't breathe for a moment. He had been born in space, raised among faraway colonies, trained to fight in massive orbital stations. Earth had always been nothing more than a legend, a place spoken of in old myths. Was it still real? And if so, how had he ended up here? The monk, as if sensing his thoughts, spoke again. Humanity never truly left Earth, Krando. It only expanded. It reached for the stars, colonized distant worlds. But our roots have always remained here. Krando turned back to the stone carving. My ancestors. For the first time in his life, he was facing something real about his own past. Delia watched him closely. The powerful, fearless warrior for the first time looked shaken. Krando clenched his fists. I want to know more. The monk nodded slowly. Then listen, warrior. There is much to tell. As Krando stared at the ancient symbols on the walls, the monk continued speaking. Humanity grew across the stars, Krando, the old man said. Earth was once home to billions. But as our reach expanded to the moon, to Mars, to distant planets, this world was left behind. Delia folded her arms. So Earth is abandoned. The monk shook his head. Not entirely. Earth still exists, but few remain here. As humanity spread outward, our homeworld became something different, a place reclaimed by nature. Still, it is our home. Krando's gaze lingered on the ancient carvings. Warriors, symbols, history he had never known. A strange feeling stirred within him. So this is my ancestors' world, he thought. But I wasn't born here. I grew up in the colonies, this place. It's foreign to me, and yet, deep inside, he felt a connection. As night fell, Krando and Delia sat outside the temple, a small fire crackling between them. The monk had retreated inside, leaving them alone. The flames cast dancing shadows across their faces. Krando tossed a stick into the fire. I've never seen you this quiet before, he said with a smirk. Delia didn't take her eyes off the flames. You say that like you've known me forever. We were trying to kill each other just this morning. Krando shrugged. I guess. Today changed a lot. Yesterday already feels distant. Delia's lips twitched slightly. Yes, the savage warrior who tried to kill me is gone. Now, there's a man who thinks, Krando exhaled, nodding. Maybe before I met you, I wasn't thinking enough. Delia turned her gaze to him. And now, are you thinking? Krando met her eyes. If you think that's all I'm doing, then you're not looking closely enough. Delia hesitated. They were staring at each other, the firelight casting a warm glow on her pale skin. This morning, they had fought to the death. Now, they sat together, in this strange world, under the same sky. And somehow, it felt natural. They both thought the same thing. This is strange, but it's not bad. Krando leaned in slightly. His face drew closer to hers. Delia's eyes widened for a split second, but she didn't pull away. Their lips were just about to touch. A flash of blinding light. The fire's warmth vanished in an instant, replaced by an overwhelming pillar of light. The air shuddered, the wind reversed direction, and Krando instinctively jumped back. A portal had opened, and someone stepped through. A tall, slender figure. Their skin was pale, nearly glowing like moonlight. Silver hair flowed down their back, and they wore a sleek, black armored suit, both elegant and functional. Krando immediately reached for his sword. But Delia's eyes widened in shock. This is impossible. Krando noticed the rare expression of disbelief on her face. Who is this? He asked. The figure stepped forward, their piercing gaze locking onto Delia. Their lips curled slightly. My name is Clarice, they said, their voice smooth yet authoritative. And I have come to take you home, Delia. Krando narrowed his eyes at Clarice's words. She had come to take Delia. Delia, however, was frozen in shock. The flickering firelight danced across her pale face, casting shifting shadows. But her eyes told an entirely different story. Clarice, she whispered. Clarice tilted her head slightly, silver hair cascading over her shoulder. It's been a long time, sister. Krando's eyebrows shot up. Sister. Delia clenched her fists, her gaze locked onto Clarice. For a moment, she seemed unsure of what to say. Then, with a deep sigh, she turned her back. I knew you'd find me, she said, her voice cold. Clarice smiled faintly. You run, I find you. That's how it's always been, hasn't it? Krando folded his arms across his chest. Is anyone going to explain what's happening, or are we just going to stand here exchanging mysterious looks? Delia glanced at him, uncertainty flickering in her expression. But then, she exhaled deeply and turned toward the fire. I was a princess, she said slowly. On my own planet, among my own people. Krando stood still for a moment. That he hadn't expected ... But I ran away. Clarice clasped her hands behind her back. And our father sent me to find you. Krando stepped toward Clarice. You opened the portal in the arena, Clarice nodded. Yes, I meant to take you from there, Delia, but something went wrong, and the portal sent you here instead. Delia shook her head. You know, I won't go back, Clarice. Clarice's smile faded. Would you like to tell that to our king? You know I didn't search for you all these years for nothing. Delia averted her gaze, but Krando saw how her fists tightened just slightly. So, you don't want to go back, Krando said, his voice low but firm. Delia lifted her head, locking eyes with him. And in that moment, Krando knew her mind was made up. I won't go back. Her voice was steady and wavering. Clarice sighed. You always make things difficult, sister. Krando leaned forward slightly. If you're planning on forcing her, you'll have to go through me first. Clarice turned her eyes to Krando. Tension filled the air instantly. The fire crackled between them, casting 3 long shadows. The moment of decision had arrived. Clarice ignored Krando's defiant stare and turned back to Delia. Her eyes softened slightly the way only someone who truly knew her could look at her. Delia stood firm, ready to resist. But Clarice spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision. Father is dying. Delia's face went completely still. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. Even Krando felt the weight of those words. For a moment, Delia didn't speak. Then she swallowed hard and whispered, You're lying. Clarice shook her head. I wish I was, sister. Delia forgot to breathe for a moment. Her father, the king. The man who had spent years searching for her. The one who had tried to control her, who had wanted her to stay a princess. But also, the man who had always been there. She lowered her gaze. Memories crashed over her. She had always known she was leaving something behind when she ran. But never this. Clarice saw the hesitation in her eyes and took another step forward. If you don't come now, you'll never see him again, Delia. Delia's fingers unconsciously tightened around the hilt of her dagger. But this time, it wasn't for battle, it was to ground herself. Finally, she lifted her eyes to Clarice and spoke, her voice quiet. How much time do we have? Clarice dipped her head slightly. If we leave now, maybe we'll make it in time. Delia closed her eyes. A few seconds of silence. Then she looked up. Fine, I'm coming. Krando's expression shifted immediately. What? You're really going? Delia turned to face him. Her resolve was unlike anything he had seen before. I have to, Krando. Krando hesitated. Then, suddenly, a smirk crept onto his face. Then you're not going alone. Delia blinked. What? Krando crossed his arms. I didn't leave you behind in the arena, and I'm not leaving you now. If you're going, I'm coming with you. Clarice arched an eyebrow, studying him. This has nothing to do with you, gladiator. Krando shot her a cool look. I make my own choices, little sister of the princess. Delia stared at him. Even with all her confusion, all her emotions pulling her in different directions, there was something steadying about him. She wasn't alone in this. Clarice sighed. I don't exactly want to bring someone like you to the palace, but... Then, to Krando's surprise, she grinned slightly. Actually, seeing you there might be entertaining. Krando secured his sword on his back. Then let's get moving. Clarice turned toward the portal and lifted her hand. The light flared once more, swirling into an open gateway. As it shimmered with unknown possibilities, the 3 of them stepped forward into the unknown. As Krando, Delia, and Clarice stepped through the glowing portal, everything changed in an instant. The silent forests of Earth, the campfire beneath the stars, and the mystical presence of the ancient temple, all of it vanished in the blink of an eye. Now, they stood in an entirely different world. The portal had deposited them inside a grand palace chamber. Towering ceilings, gold-trimmed walls, and an air of heavy regal authority filled the space. Krando's sharp eyes swept across the room. He had never seen such luxury before. The worlds he had grown up in were practical, harsh, built for survival rather than splendor. But this was a kingdom. He could see it in the architecture, in the polished floors, and in the way every guard and servant carried themselves. Delia, however, looked different. This was once her home, but it had been a long time since she had been here. Clarice, on the other hand, looked completely at ease. "We must go to the king immediately," she said. "His condition is worsening." Krando said nothing, but his instincts screamed that something was wrong. Still, he kept his suspicions to himself for now. As they walked through the palace, guards and attendants stopped to stare at Delia. Their faces showed shock, recognition, and respect. The runaway princess had returned. After several tense minutes, the great doors to the royal chamber opened. Inside, the king lay on his bed. His face was pale, his hollow eyes barely open. Even in his weakened state, it was clear that this man had once been a powerful ruler, but now, he was fading. Delia's breath caught as she stepped forward. "Father." The king slowly turned his head. A weak smile flickered across his lips. "You came back." Krando stood silently behind her, watching the moment unfold. It should have been an emotional reunion. But something felt off. The king's gaze drifted toward Clarice. His voice was hoarse as he whispered, "My son, thank you for bringing her back." Clarice inclined his head slightly. "I would do anything for you, father." Delia stepped closer to the bed and gently took the king's hand. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. The king's eyes flickered toward Clarice for the briefest moment. And in that instant, Krando noticed it. A spark of doubt, a flicker of mistrust. But the king was too weak to voice it. One of the palace physicians stepped forward. "He has been poisoned," the doctor said grimly. "We do not know who is responsible." Delia's expression hardened. "Poison," Clarice immediately cut in. "But don't worry, Delia. There may still be a way to save him." Delia spun toward him. "What way?" Clarice's face remained carefully composed. "There is a healer deep within the palace," he explained. "But she is dangerous. She only makes deals with those of royal blood. You are the only one who can speak to her." Delia hesitated. Krando stepped forward. "I'm going with her," he said firmly. Clarice turned to him, his expression unreadable, but his eyes. There was a cold edge behind them. "This is a family matter, Krando," Clarice replied smoothly. Krando crossed his arms and gave a half-smirk. "Delia is my family now." Delia looked up at him. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she turned back to Clarice. "If I go, Krando goes with me." Clarice exhaled slowly. "Fine, if that's what you want." As Delia and Krando prepared for their journey, Clarice stepped into his private chambers. He looked at his own reflection in the polished mirror, a smirk forming on his lips. "Father is already dying," he thought, "and Delia, I can't let her stay. I can't let her interfere once I take the throne." His fingers slid over the hilt of the dagger at his side. He would accompany them, pretending to help, but his real goal. Delia and Krando would not be leaving that healer's chambers alive. With every step they took, Krando's unease deepened. As Clarice led them through the cold, dimly lit corridors deep within the palace, Krando kept his hand close to his sword, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Something was wrong. The silence here felt unnatural. Delia walked beside him, unaware of the full extent of his suspicion, but Krando's sole focus was on protecting her. "This isn't right," he thought. "I can feel it." He watched Clarice closely, his relaxed posture, the way he walked with too much confidence. This was a trap, but what kind of trap? At the end of the corridor stood massive iron doors. Clarice pushed them open without hesitation and stepped inside. Krando and Delia followed, but there was no healer waiting for them. The room was vast and dark, surrounded by cold stone walls, with only a few torches casting faint light in the emptiness. Something about it felt wrong. Delia frowned. "What is this place?" Krando subtly glanced behind him, checking if the doors had closed. They were still open for now. But everything felt off. Then Clarice laughed. A slow, mocking chuckle. As he turned, his gaze locked onto Delia's. This, he said smoothly, is one of the deepest, most forgotten dungeons of the palace. No one ever returns from here. Delia's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Krando's jaw tightened. He's saying he brought you here to kill you. For a moment, Delia froze. Then, she slowly turned her icy gaze toward Clarice. Why would you want me dead, Clarice? Clarice tilted his head. Do you really not know? I will take the throne, Delia. Our father is dying, and as long as you're alive, they will follow his last wish. The people want you. They don't trust me. His eyes gleamed with twisted satisfaction. But if you're gone, he smiled darkly, I become the only heir. Delia stepped forward, fury burning in her gaze. Father loved you as his own son. And you poisoned him? Krando's eyes sharpened. What? Clarice smirked. Clever man. At least one of you catches on quickly. Delia clenched her fists. You really did it. Clarice spread his arms. Father was old, Delia. His time was already running out. But you need to die. Krando understood everything now. And he had already made his decision. No matter what, I'm getting Delia out of here alive. He gripped his sword, slowly drawing it from his back. So what's your plan, Prince? He said, voice steady. How exactly do you plan to kill us? Clarice tilted his head slightly, as if enjoying the moment. This is where things get interesting. From the shadows behind him, black-armored soldiers emerged. At least 6 men, all heavily armed. Krando's lips curled into a sharp grin as he fully unsheathed his sword. So that's your play. You brought a few men to kill us in the dark. Delia pulled her daggers, her icy fury fully focused on Clarice. Clarice sighed with amusement. Not to kill you, Krando. His voice lowered. They want you alive. Krando narrowed his eyes. Me. Clarice's smirk deepened. I've done some research on you, Krando. Turns out your ancestry goes a little deeper than just being a warrior from Earth, but to learn the truth. His eyes glowed with cruel delight. You'll have to survive first. Krando and Delia exchanged a brief but knowing glance. They both thought the same thing. We have to fight our way out, no matter the cost. And then, the soldiers attacked. The dim torchlight cast flickering shadows across the stone walls, illuminating the battlefield in an eerie dance of light and darkness. Steel clashed against steel. The scent of blood and sweat hung thick in the air. Once again, Krando and Delia fought side by side, a deadly duo bound by instinct and survival. Krando's blade tore through the defenses of Clarice's armored soldiers, cutting them down one by one. Meanwhile, Delia moved like a shadow, her daggers striking with lethal precision. Krando parried an enemy's sword strike, twisting his blade and driving it deep into the man's chest. The soldier let out a muffled scream before collapsing. At the same time, Delia slit another's throat, silencing him instantly. Only one enemy remained. Clarice. Even as his men lay dead around him, Clarice did not panic. Instead, a cold smile formed on his lips. You truly are impressive, he murmured, nodding slightly. But no matter how skilled you are, there are some things a sword cannot solve. Krando tightened his grip on his sword. Enough talk, fight. But Clarice merely raised his hand and the air around them shifted. A dark energy began to rise from the dimly lit chamber. The torches flickered violently, and the temperature plunged. Krando felt it immediately, the sheer weight of Clarice's power. Then he saw Clarice's eyes. They were pitch black. Delia's gaze hardened. You were a mage all along. Clarice let out a low chuckle, bowing his head slightly. Did I never tell you, sister? I am not just a prince. I am also a master of the arcane. Krando clenched his jaw. This was bad. And then, Clarice released his magic. A wave of dark energy shot straight toward Delia. She tried to dodge, but the magic was too fast. At that moment, Krando made his move. Krando lunged forward, his sword aimed directly at Clarice's chest. Time slowed. As Clarice unleashed his spell, his eyes widened in shock. Krando's blade pierced him, driving deep into his body. Clarice gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "This isn't possible," he whispered. Krando didn't blink. He pushed the sword deeper, ensuring the killing blow. He was not a prince, he was a warrior. Clarice's body trembled, his knees buckling beneath him. His breath came in ragged gasps, blood dripping onto the cold stone floor. And then, his body collapsed. Clarice was dead. Krando wasted no time. He ripped his sword free and spun around. And his world shattered. Delia lay on the ground. Clarice's magic had burned through her chest, leaving her body weak and trembling. Krando dropped to his knees, pulling her into his arms. Her pale skin looked even paler than before. "Delia, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, a faint smile touching her lips. "You're always so loud." Krando forced a smile, but his heart pounded with panic. "Don't do this. I'm getting you out of here." Delia shook her head slightly. "Do you remember how we met? You were trying to kill me." Krando's throat tightened. "Don't remind me. I have no intention of losing you now." Delia's weak fingers brushed against his face. "This is strange," she whispered. "This morning, we were trying to kill each other. And now, I wish we had more time, Krando." Krando's chest ached. I swear, I'll find a way to save you." But Delia simply shook her head. "I know. You would do anything to protect me." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But sometimes, things just happen, Krando." Her eyes grew heavier, her body falling limp in his arms. Just before she took her last breath, she looked at him one final time and whispered, "Thank you for fighting for me." Then, her eyes closed forever, and Krando's world went silent.